Moving on, let's take a look at the save endpoint. The purpose of this endpoint was to demonstrate how to create a record and store it in Cassandra. In this case, when this endpoint's called, note that I'm using a post mapping. This is because from a REST perspective, we use the HTTP verbs of get for getting data, put for modifying data, post for adding data, and delete for deleting data. And it's these annotations which we're using to model the REST behavior in terms of the endpoints. So this one specifically takes a required parameter of value, which we pass into the storage service. And we come in here, we see that what it's doing is it's constructing an entity. In this case, it's a Cassandra entity that just has an ID and a value, the value we're giving it. And we're giving it a random ID, and we're passing it into our entity repo and saving it. Notice that if you click into this, you get some very complicated looking Java. This has to do with the Cassandra integration, and if we look at what we're actually doing here, there's a lot of magic that's happening. But essentially what happens is that you create an interface in Java that's meant to represent how you want to interface with your entity or your record set directly. So I'm creating a Cassandra repository and saying it's going to work for my entity, which by the way, its primary key or ID is going to be the string. What this does though is that when I look at how to call my entity, since my entity actually extends all this other behavior, I inherit the basic capability to save the entity as a record, to update it, to add it, to do all sorts of things, and to query it directly just by relying on what the Spring framework provides. So if we go over to save, enter in a value, try it out, hit execute, what happens is it makes this RESTful call, and you can see what it looks like in terms of a post, and the response is it just returns the entity that was created, the random ID along with the some value. So the next question is, well then, how do I validate that this got put in the database? That's when we look at a service that was created from a controller perspective. So I used a get annotation so that get list will work. And what happens is that this is saying that when this endpoint is called, it's going to return a list of entities. And I see that it's calling the storage service.list. So if I click into that, you'll see that I'm just calling the entity repository directly and just saying find all. This is again an inherited method from the underlying Cassandra integration that knows that I just want to return all the records in the database. So when I look at my list operation here in Swagger, when I hit execute, what we're going to find is that it's going to just pull all of the entity records we created in that Cassandra database and just return them. So you can see here it's the same ID and the same value that we put in place. And I can keep doing this. For example, I can come in here and say another value, execute it, then come down here and run list. You can see that now I have a second value being returned. So this demonstrates the basic ability to retrieve and create records of a custom object type within a Cassandra database, relying on the fact that the Spring integration, Spring Boot framework itself is actually handling all of these mapping between plain Java objects or plain old Java objects called POJOs and the underlying database records, and also representing that as JSON from an HTTP perspective.